The $10 bill spun twice through the air and settled against the tip of Nolan Reed's shoe. In front of the entire executive board, Chief Executive Vivian Blackwood ordered the single father to bend down and pick it up, as if his dignity could be priced that cheaply. No one in that room knew Nolan had already found 3 forged signatures, 1 hidden loan, and the clock counting down to the moment the bank would freeze every asset Blackwood Dominion owned. He did not bend. Nolan only looked at Vivian and said, "Your $100 million empire is already dead. If you want to watch an arrogant power broker pay and a dismissed man turn the board against her, subscribe to this channel right now." The morning Blackwood Dominion Aerospace planned to announce the largest acquisition in its history, the headquarters looked less like an office and more like a stage built for a coronation. Camera crews unloaded equipment near the glass atrium, investors in tailored suits drifted toward the reception hall, and a fleet of black cars lined the circular drive that curved past the founder's bronze statue. The company had spent weeks preparing for the reveal of the SkyRest Components deal, a purchase valued at $38 million that would push Blackwood Dominion into a new tier of aviation manufacturing. Everyone who mattered had been invited to see Vivian Blackwood step forward as the woman who had carried her late father's empire into a brighter decade. The lobby smelled of fresh flowers and expensive coffee, and the mood carried the confident hum of people who believed nothing could go wrong. It was the kind of morning designed to be photographed, remembered, and framed. Nolan Reed arrived in a sedan he had driven for more than 10 years, easing it into a distant corner of the lot where the visiting journalists would not have to see it. His suit was clean and well-fitted, but carried no famous label, and he wore it the way a man wears armor he cannot quite afford. A pair of younger managers near the entrance smirked at the travel mug in his hand, trading a quiet joke about the risk officer who still brewed his own coffee at home instead of buying it in the Marble Cafe downstairs. Nolan pretended not to hear them because he had learned long ago that the people who mocked small economies were usually the ones drowning in invisible debt. He carried a worn leather case under one arm, the same case he had used when he still worked as a corporate restructuring consultant, back before his wife died, and he traded a punishing travel schedule for a steady job and a chance to raise his daughter himself. He did not miss the money from those years nearly as much as people assumed. He missed being believed. Before he even reached his office, his phone buzzed with a short call from his daughter, Marin, 16 years old and already better at reading his moods than anyone else alive. She wished him luck for his presentation to the board and reminded him to eat something before noon, and he promised he would. And then she was gone, back to her own morning, unaware of anything happening inside the tower. That brief voice was the whole reason he still walked into buildings like this one at all. When Nolan opened the risk governance system at his desk, the calm morning ended for him. In the space of a few minutes, he found 3 things that did not belong, and each one was worse than the last. A pool of receivables, money the company was owed by its customers, had somehow been pledged as collateral against 2 separate loans at the same time, which meant the same asset had been promised to 2 different lenders. His own electronic signature appeared on a risk assessment he had never reviewed, approving language he would never have written. And the bridge loan from Carrington Capital, the short-term financing meant to fund the acquisition, contained a clause allowing the lender to seize assets the instant any material information proved false. Nolan sat very still and understood that the deal was not merely risky, it had already breached its own conditions days ago, and the breach was hiding in plain sight, waiting for a machine to notice it. He drafted an urgent message to the chief financial officer, Conrad Sterling, laying out the double-pledged collateral and the forged approval in careful, unemotional language. The reply came back within minutes and contained no denial at all, only a smooth dismissal. "Don't ruin the biggest day in this company's history over a few data cells," Conrad wrote, as if the whole matter were a rounding error that a nervous man had blown out of proportion. Nolan read it twice, then opened the system's access to confirm what he already feared. The record showed that his account had approved the disputed file at 2:14 in the morning, a time when he was asleep in his own home, 3 towns away, with his phone charging on the kitchen counter and his daughter's door closed down the hall. Nolan did not raise his voice when he walked into Conrad Sterling's office. Men who raise their voices have usually already lost the argument. He set down a single printed page, the access log showing the impossible early morning approval, and asked the chief financial officer to postpone the announcement for 1 day so the collateral question could be resolved before the bank noticed it.
Conrad leaned back in his chair, unbothered, and did not pretend the numbers were wrong. Instead, he shifted with the easy grace of a man who had done this before into a threat so soft that it could almost be mistaken for concern. He reminded Nolan in a gentle voice that a single father needed reliable health coverage, a steady salary, and a flexible schedule that let him be home for a teenage daughter. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken and unmistakable, that all of those things could vanish if Nolan kept insisting on being difficult about a triumph the whole company had already decided to celebrate. Nolan did not step back. He explained plainly that the bank had installed an automatic reconciliation process after Blackwood Dominion applied to increase its credit line, and that this system would cross-check the pledged assets against every registered loan at midnight. When it ran, it would find the same collateral promised twice, and no amount of confidence would talk a computer out of what it saw. Conrad answered that Vivian had signed the certifications and the board had approved the deal, as though authority alone could bend arithmetic. Nolan replied that a chief executive's signature could make a false statement official, but it could never make it true, and the difference between those two things was exactly the difference between a delay today and a disaster at midnight. Conrad's smile thinned, but he did not budge, and Nolan understood that persuasion had reached its limit. So Nolan did the only thing left that was both correct and defensible. He followed the procedure to the letter. He filed a confidential report with the board's audit committee, with the company's independent outside counsel, and with the bank's own compliance division, attaching the time-stamped evidence of the double pledge and the forged approval. That report triggered an 8-hour remediation window, a legally recognized period in which the company could still disclose its own error, delay the acquisition, and negotiate a corrected agreement with the bank before any penalty took hold. There was still a clean way out, a narrow door that remained open for exactly 8 hours, and Nolan had just handed the company the key. He returned to his desk believing the machinery of good process would now do its work. What he did not know was that Conrad Sterling had quietly intercepted the internal copy of that report before it reached Harrison Kingsley, the aging chairman of the board, and had told Vivian an entirely different story. In Conrad's version, a resentful mid-level employee was attempting to extort the company on the morning of its greatest triumph, threatening to sabotage the acquisition unless his petty grievances were addressed. Vivian had just finished a photo session for a business magazine, standing beneath studio lights in a suit that cost more than Nolan's car, and she was in no mood to hear that a nobody from the risk department wanted to delay the defining moment of her career. Her father's legacy had loomed over her years, and the Skyrest deal was meant to prove at last that she was more than an heir. She summoned Nolan to the top-floor conference room where Conrad, Grant Carrington, and several directors were already waiting, and she prepared to make an example of him. Nolan arrived carrying his documents, the printed logs, and the time-stamped report, but Vivian never let him present a single page. She spoke over him from the head of the long table, her voice cool and amused, telling the room that she had learned there was an employee so obsessed with a delayed $100 reimbursement that he was now trying to hold the entire company hostage. People like Nolan, she said, always dressed up their greed as ethics, always pretended to care about principle when what they really wanted was more money in their own pocket. Nolan tried twice to warn her that the remediation window was closing and that midnight would take the decision out of everyone's hands. Vivian dismissed it as a manipulation, a frightened man's trick designed to make her flinch, and she decided in that moment to show the entire board exactly how little his warnings were worth to her. She opened the slim wallet on the table in front of her, drew out a single crisp $100 bill, and rose from her chair.
The room went quiet as she walked around the long table toward Nolan, the bill held between two fingers, every director's eyes following her, Grant Carrington watching with the still patience of a man appraising a transaction. She stopped a few feet from Nolan and let the bill fall from her hand. It dropped to the polished marble floor, spun once, and came to rest against the tip of his shoe. "That's more than the reimbursement you keep whining about," Vivian said loud enough for every director to hear. "Pick it up." She wanted Grant Carrington and the rest of them to see with their own eyes that she could control her people with money and with fear, that a wave of cash could buy silence and obedience from anyone who worked beneath her. Conrad Sterling allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. A few of the directors found somewhere else to look, studying the tabletop or the skyline through the glass, but not one of them said a word in Nolan's defense. Near the door, an executive assistant named Tessa Monroe stood frozen, watching the whole thing, her hand tightening around the tablet she carried. Nolan did not flush with anger, did not answer the insult with his own insult, and did not so much as glance down at the money by his foot. He looked at Vivian with a steadiness that unsettled her more than any outburst could have, and he asked her one final question clearly so the room would remember it. Would she, of her own free will, postpone the acquisition and disclose the unreported loan before the deadline passed? Vivian laughed sharp and short and told him he was fired, effective immediately, for insubordination, for spreading panic, and for threatening the value of the company.
She added, for the benefit of the lawyers in the room, that she wanted the legal department to begin preparing a suit against him for corporate sabotage. Nolan looked at his watch. The self-remediation window had closed 3 minutes earlier, quietly while she was still talking about the money on the floor. He let a breath pass, and then he said the words that would follow Vivian Blackwood for the rest of her career. "You think I'm threatening the future of Blackwood Dominion? I'm not talking about the future. Your $100 million empire is already dead." Vivian laughed again, certain now that this was nothing more than a beaten man trying to save face on his way out the door, a last theatrical line before security walked him to the lobby. She could not imagine that anything he said might already be true. Nolan set his employee badge on the table without ceremony and asked Tessa Monroe to record in the official minutes that he had refused to sign a false document and delivered his warning within the required deadline. Then he gathered his worn leather case, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving the $100 bill exactly where it had landed. After he was gone, Tessa bent down, picked up the bill, and slipped it into a personnel department envelope as part of the termination record, unaware in the moment that this small, careful act would one day become hard evidence of retaliation against a person who had reported wrongdoing. On the street outside the tower, Nolan answered a call from the bank's compliance officer, who confirmed only that the report had been received and would not say what came next. Nolan did not gloat, even to himself. He told the officer simply that the company still had real assets, real contracts, and genuinely talented people who deserved better than the men steering them. What had died, he said, was not the business itself, but the structure of power sitting on top of it, the arrogant machinery that had been hiding fraud behind a founder's name and a daughter's ambition. He ended the call and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the reflection of the city move across the tower's glass. Inside, unaware of any of it, Vivian was walking toward the stage to announce the acquisition. Behind her, the financial displays that were meant to show soaring projections flickered and turned red all at once as the bank froze an $18 million credit line in real time. The announcement became a disaster in front of the very cameras that were supposed to immortalize it. When the bank declined to release the final tranche of financing, the Skyrest acquisition collapsed on stage, and Vivian was left standing beneath the red screens, her prepared speech dying in her throat, while investors murmured and journalists lifted their phones. Within the hour, two of the company's largest suppliers received automated alerts from their trade credit insurers and demanded that Blackwood Dominion pay in advance before another shipment of components would leave their docks. The confident hum of the morning curdled into something anxious and sharp, and the people who had come to witness a coronation found themselves watching a slow public unraveling. Grant Carrington, seated in the front row, arranged his features into an expression of shock, but he moved with the speed of a man who knew exactly when the floor would give way. Before the day ended, he had offered Vivian a rescue loan. The terms of that rescue were quietly monstrous. Carrington Capital would provide emergency financing, but only in exchange for the right to seize the company's most valuable patents if Blackwood Dominion was so much as a single day late on repayment, a condition Grant presented as generosity, and Vivian, cornered and frightened, was tempted to accept. Meanwhile, Conrad Sterling worked on her from the other side, insisting that the entire catastrophe had been engineered by Nolan Reed, who supposedly fed false information to the bank out of spite after his firing. Conrad urged her to protect herself by publicly branding Nolan a disgruntled former employee, a saboteur whose bitterness had cost the company its future. Vivian, desperate to control a story that was already slipping away from her, agreed to hold a brief press conference. Standing before a thin crowd of skeptical journalists, she blamed the collapse on the reckless dishonesty of one dismissed man. That statement rippled outward and did real damage to a person who had done nothing but tell the truth. Nolan found himself attacked across professional networks and industry forums, painted as the man who had detonated a $100 million company, and within days, two firms that were ready to interview him quietly withdrew their invitations. He did not respond in public, did not fire back with a statement of his own, because he understood that a war of words was exactly the fight his enemies wanted, and the one he was least likely to win. Instead, he met with an employment lawyer named Evelyn Hart and handed him clean copies of every warning he had filed, each one stamped with a date and time that preceded his firing by hours. Evelyn read through them slowly, her expression sharpening from professional caution to something closer to hunger. When she finished, she looked up and told him that he was protected under whistleblower law and that every defamatory statement and every deleted file only deepened the company's exposure. Back inside the tower, the walls Conrad had built began to develop cracks he could not see. Harrison Kingsley, the chairman, finally received a copy of the report that Conrad had worked so hard to keep from him, forwarded by a nervous member of the audit committee who had grown tired of being kept in the dark. The old man read it in silence, and then he read it again, and by the time he set the pages down, his loyalty to the Blackwood family collided head-on with his duty to the shareholders and employees he was sworn to protect. He demanded an independent audit immediately, with full access to the company's servers and financial records. Conrad, sensing the ground shifting, prepared a countermeasure of his own.
A forged email that appeared to show Nolan agreeing months earlier to pledge the receivables as collateral. He wanted to recast Nolan not as the man who exposed the scheme, but as its original architect. He was not the only one watching the details. Tessa Monroe, still moving quietly through the executive floor, noticed Conrad instructing a technology staffer to change the creation date on a set of files, and she recognized the request for exactly what it was. Without drawing attention to herself, she preserved a copy of the original system log before the alteration could take hold, tucking the evidence away the way a person tucks away something she may need to survive. Vivian, for her part, still believed the entire crisis was a problem that money could solve, because money had solved every problem she had ever faced. She sent an intermediary to invite Nolan to a private suite in a quiet hotel, where a representative offered him a settlement of $500,000 in exchange for withdrawing his report and signing a non-disclosure agreement. It was a sum designed to look like mercy, and function like a muzzle. Nolan refused it without hesitation, and his refusal was not about pride. He told the intermediary that he did not want a payoff. He wanted the company to stop defaming him, to restore the auditor's access, and to guarantee the wages of ordinary employees before a single bonus was paid to anyone in leadership. He named those conditions plainly, then rose and left, and the intermediary carried the answer back to a chief executive who could not understand why $500,000 had failed to make a poor man quiet. That evening, Vivian's lawyers played their strongest card. They arranged a meeting, sat Nolan across a polished table, and laid a single sheet of paper in front of him, an email bearing his own signature in which he appeared to have personally approved the very transaction he had reported as fraud. Conrad Sterling was certain the forged email would break Nolan, would send him scrambling to explain himself, and better still, would make him look guilty in the eyes of anyone who saw it. But Nolan read the document with the slow attention of a man who had spent 20 years reading exactly these kinds of documents, and within a minute he found the flaw. The email referred to the risk governance system by its old internal name, a name that had been formally retired and replaced 3 full weeks before the date the email was supposedly written and sent. A person genuinely composing that message on that day would use the current name. Only someone reconstructing the past after the fact would reach for the label that no longer existed. Nolan felt the discovery settle into place, cold and certain, but he did not reveal the flaw. He chose instead to let Conrad believe the forgery had worked so that the man would grow confident and keep manufacturing more false evidence. Each new fabrication another thread to pull later. Working with Evelyn Hart, Nolan moved to protect the ground beneath the whole case. She petitioned the court for an order preserving the company's servers, and a team of digital forensic specialists was appointed to image the data before Conrad could delete or overwrite anything. With that safeguard in place, Nolan began following the money, tracing the outbound payments that had drained value from the company through a series of vendors. 3 names surfaced again and again: Orion Ridge Logistics, Vale Rest Materials, and Crown Harbor Consulting. When he pulled their registration records, all 3 traced back to the same virtual office address, a single mail drop dressed up as 3 thriving businesses, and the attorney of record for all of them had, until recently, worked directly for Carrington Capital. The coincidence was not a coincidence at all. It was a blueprint. Following the invoices, Nolan calculated that $7.4 million had been siphoned out of Blackwood Dominion in the form of shipping fees, raw materials, and consulting services that had never existed. The true shape of the scheme finally came clear to him, and it was worse than a simple fraud to prop up a deal. Conrad had not merely inflated revenue to help Vivian close the Skyrest acquisition, he had been quietly pulling cash out of the company, weakening its ability to repay its debts, deliberately engineering the kind of default that would let Grant Carrington move in and seize the patents, the maintenance contracts, and the land at a fraction of their worth. Vivian sat unknowingly at the center of a trap built to consume her family's empire, and the 2 men closest to the money were the ones setting the snare. She had signed certifications that Nolan had warned were false, and she had fired and defamed him to protect a reputation that was already forfeit. Nolan refused to let her cast herself as a pure victim because the truth was more complicated than innocence. She had not known the full architecture of the takeover, but she had chosen not to look, had chosen her pride over 600 employees, had chosen to humiliate the one man trying to save her. Harrison Kingsley arranged a private meeting with Nolan away from Vivian and Conrad, and in that quiet room, the old chairman admitted with visible difficulty that the board had failed in its most basic duty to oversee the executives. He asked, almost pleading, whether Blackwood Dominion could still be saved, or whether the damage had gone too deep to repair.
Nolan did not offer comfort he could not back with numbers. He told Harrison the truth, which was that the core of the company still had genuine value. There were $43 million in real, confirmed orders on the books. The maintenance workshops were still profitable, servicing private aircraft on schedules that had nothing to do with the fraud upstairs. The overwhelming majority of the workforce had no part in any wrongdoing and reported to work each day building things that actually functioned, and the patents remained valuable, worth defending, so long as they never fell into Carrington's hands. But saving what was real, Nolan said, required cutting away what was rotten, and he laid out 4 conditions in a voice that left no room for negotiation. Suspend Conrad Sterling immediately, have Vivian temporarily surrender operational control, disclose the violations to the bank voluntarily, and open the entire company to a full forensic audit.
Harrison hesitated, and Nolan understood why. Accepting those terms meant admitting in front of the board and eventually the public that the Blackwood empire had collapsed under Vivian's leadership, that the founder's daughter had presided over its near destruction. For a man who'd known the family for 40 years, who'd stood at the founder's funeral, it was an unbearable thing to sign. He turned the conditions over in his mind, weighing loyalty against responsibility. And just as he opened his mouth to answer, his assistant slipped into the room with a message that changed the arithmetic entirely. Grant Carrington had formally notified the company that Carrington Capital would move to seize its assets in 48 hours. The clock, which had never truly stopped, had simply changed its face. Now the threat of losing the company was no longer a warning, but a countdown, and everyone in the building could feel it. If Carrington gained control of the patents and the maintenance contracts, more than 600 employees could lose their jobs, even though the factories themselves were still turning a profit. And that arithmetic finally broke through Vivian's certainty. She agreed at last to meet Nolan in the same top-floor conference room where she had thrown money at his feet. And this time, the room held no journalists, no security detail, and no subordinates for her to perform her power in front of. It was just the two of them, and the long, empty table, and the light coming gray through the glass. She began where she always began, with an offer of money and position, promising to restore his title, triple his salary, and grant him equity if he would only stand before the press and say the whole affair had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Nolan let her finish before he answered. He refused, because the offer, generous as it sounded, was still built entirely around protecting Vivian, and he told her so without cruelty. The company did not need a fresh lie to cover the old one, he said. It needed to stop lying altogether. Vivian's composure cracked, and she accused him of enjoying this, of savoring the sight of her failure after everything she had said to him. Nolan answered that revenge were what he wanted. He could have it for free simply by staying silent and letting Grant Carrington take everything she had. The fact that he was standing in this room at all, offering to help, was the proof that his goal had never been to watch her fall. His goal was to save the people who had never been invited into the rooms where the bad decisions were made. Then he laid out a plan, point by point, in the flat, practical voice of a man who had rebuilt broken companies before. First, disclose the violations voluntarily ahead of the seizure deadline to seize control of the narrative and the legal timeline. Second, prove that Carrington had known the collateral was inflated and use that knowledge to challenge the lender's right to seize anything at all. Third, formally cancel the Skycrest deal that started the collapse. Fourth, sell the executive aircraft and the other luxury assets the company did not need to function. Fifth, use that cash to guarantee 3 payroll cycles for the workforce. Sixth, persuade the suppliers to extend their terms by 30 days. And seventh, appoint an independent restructuring director with real authority to see it all through. Vivian asked wearily who could possibly take on that final role, who the board would ever trust with that kind of power over the company's finances.
Harrison Kingsley, standing near the door, answered for her. The board had already voted, he said, and they had chosen Nolan Reed. It was the great reversal, complete and undeniable. The man who had been thrown out of this very building days earlier was returning with financial authority that outranked the chief executive herself. But Nolan did not accept the role on faith or on flattery. He set his own condition in return, and it was precise. Vivian would sign the order suspending her own operational authority in writing, and she would publicly correct the accusation she had made against him. Vivian felt the humiliation of it in her chest, but she no longer had a choice, and she signed the document under the witnessing eyes of the board. The moment Nolan took control, however, Conrad Sterling struck back. He leaked the forged email to the press and declared that Nolan was the true designer of the dangerous financial mechanisms that endangered the company. And for a few dangerous hours, public suspicion swung back toward Nolan. Several members of the board, rattled by the fresh scandal, began to whisper about reversing the appointment before it had even begun. At an emergency meeting called that same afternoon, Conrad arrived flanked by Grant Carrington's attorney and announced with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand that he possessed evidence which would see Nolan under criminal investigation before the day was over. The emergency audit meeting turned into the confrontation that would decide the fate of the company. Conrad stood at the front of the room and worked through his case with practiced calm, displaying the forged email, the risk assessments bearing Nolan's signature, and a spreadsheet that showed that Nolan had once modeled the possibility of using the receivables as collateral. Nolan let him finish, then acknowledged without flinching that the spreadsheet was indeed his own work. But he explained what Conrad had carefully hidden. It was a warning model built to show why such a pledge would be dangerous, not a proposal to carry it out. Conrad had deleted a single line written in red that sat at the bottom of the original file. That line had read in plain words that the transaction must never be executed because it would violate the company's credit conditions and its counterparty agreements. And its absence was itself a kind of confession.
The digital forensics team delivered the finding that turned the room. The email supposedly proving Nolan's guilt had been created after the date he was fired. They reported copied from a file on the CFO's own server with its send time altered to place it in the past. The technical evidence was clean, dated, and impossible to argue away, and the faces around the table began to change. Then Tessa Monroe stepped forward, carrying the original access log she had preserved before Conrad could alter it, and she confirmed something else as well. Conrad had personally instructed her to change a meeting schedule in the calendar system to manufacture the impression that Nolan had attended an approval session that had never actually taken place, and the forensic specialists added the detail that sealed it. All three of the forged electronic signatures had been generated from a single security device inside Conrad Sterling's own office. Cornered, Conrad abandoned his attack on Nolan and turned on Vivian instead. He told the room that she had pressured him, that she had demanded the deal succeed at any cost, that she had made it clear she would not tolerate any reason for postponing the acquisition. Vivian, pale and rigid at the end of the table, was forced to admit that she had indeed told him she did not want to hear another excuse for postponing the acquisition. Nolan let the two of them expose each other, then drew a careful distinction that the entire board needed to hear. Conrad had actively committed fraud and embezzlement, funneling millions through shell companies. Grant Carrington had financed the scheme in order to seize the company's assets. Vivian had not known the full conspiracy, but she had willfully ignored the warnings that raised them, and the board itself had failed in its duty of oversight. Grant Carrington, seated near the wall, remained unnervingly calm. Even if Conrad had committed crimes, he said, the loan agreement still gave Carrington Capital the right to seize the company's assets, and no amount of internal drama would change the contract.
It was then that Nolan produced the next reversal. A clause buried in that very agreement, he explained, stated that the lender forfeited its priority claim if it had known the borrower's financial information was false before it dispersed the funds. Grant's confidence flickered, and Nolan pressed the advantage, laying out a chain of emails between Grant and Conrad that proved Grant had known all along that the 3 vendors were shell companies. In those messages, Grant had instructed Conrad to keep the fraudulent invoices in place precisely so that Blackwood Dominion would breach its loan conditions. That evidence transformed Grant Carrington from an innocent creditor into an active participant in the conspiracy. His right to seize the assets was immediately suspended, and the debt itself now stood exposed to being partially voided by a court that would not reward a lender for engineering the very default it sought to profit from. For the first time, Grant lost his composure, the mask of the patient financier slipping to reveal something colder underneath. He threatened to drag the matter through years of litigation, to bleed the company dry with legal fees until there was nothing left to fight over. And for a moment, the threat carried real weight, because litigation was expensive and the company was fragile. Nolan met his eyes and answered without raising his voice. Grant would not have enough time, he said, and then he revealed the last card of the day. The 3 major suppliers had agreed to resume deliveries, but only on the condition that Blackwood Dominion remove every leader tied to the fraud before 5 p.m. that afternoon. The board now faced a single, unavoidable decision: who would be cut away to save the company, and how quickly. Conrad Sterling made his move at once, demanding internal immunity in exchange for testimony against Grant Carrington, offering to trade what he knew for a promise of protection. Nolan refused to make any secret bargain, telling the room plainly that he had no authority to grant immunity and no intention of pretending otherwise. Instead, he turned over the entire body of evidence to the investigators and the independent auditors, letting the law decide what Conrad's cooperation was worth. Grant Carrington, meanwhile, received a whispered message from his attorney and rose without a word, leaving the meeting once he understood that the accounts tied to the 3 shell companies were now under formal review. To avoid generating any further evidence against himself, he quietly suspended his plan to seize the company's assets. Vivian made her last attempt to hold the chief executive's chair, reminding the board that the name Blackwood had built this company from nothing, that her family's history was woven into its walls. Nolan answered her, not unkindly, but without mercy, that a name could not make payroll, could not run a factory, and could not replace the trust that had already been spent. Harrison Kingsley called for a vote. When the hands were counted, Vivian was removed from her position as chief executive, though she retained a single non-executive seat until the investigation concluded, and Conrad Sterling was fired outright for fraud and for the destruction of evidence. Nolan Reed was granted temporary operational authority with a mandate to save the business over the next 90 days. He did not pause to celebrate. He began to work before the meeting had even fully adjourned.
He established an independent whistleblower channel so that the next person who saw something wrong would not have to stand alone in a conference room while money was thrown at their feet. And he routed every major contract through the audit committee, stripping the chief executive's office of the unchecked power that had made the whole disaster possible. Vivian watched the people who had once bowed to her begin to report to Nolan instead, and she understood slowly that her power had not been stolen. She had destroyed the trust that held it up. At a follow-up press conference, the same setting where she had once branded him a saboteur, Vivian was made to correct the record. She confirmed before the cameras that Nolan Reed had not damaged the company, that he had raised his warnings through the proper channels and on time, and that his firing had been wrong. A journalist called out to Nolan, asking whether he intended to sue Vivian for millions in damages. He answered that the question of litigation would be handled by the lawyers in due course, but that his immediate goal was to protect the people who had never once been invited into the room where the terrible decisions were made. Meanwhile, Tissa Monroe delivered a sealed envelope to the auditors. Inside was the $100 bill, logged now as evidence that Nolan had been humiliated and retaliated against in the very hour he had tried to save the company. The bill Vivian used to prove that Nolan could be bought had become in the end an exhibit against her. But even as the company seemed to steady itself, a new blow arrived. Just as the immediate crisis eased, Nolan received word that a major client intended to cancel a $21 million contract unless Blackwood Dominion could prove by the following morning that it remained capable of operating at all. It was the largest single contract on the books, and losing it would undo much of what he had fought to preserve. He had a single night to demonstrate that a company the whole world had watched collapse on stage could still deliver on its most important promise. He did not reach for a speech. Nolan gathered the workshop foreman, the engineers, the key suppliers, and the bank into a single video conference and set the real numbers in front of all of them, the true state of the orders, the actual production capacity, and the cash flow that would exist after the restructuring took hold. For the first time in years, the managers below the executive floor were allowed to speak directly, without fear of embarrassing a chief executive who could not bear to be corrected. One workshop foreman revealed that the company could cut 18% from its costs simply by dropping the fictitious shipping firm Conrad had forced on them, a saving that had been sitting in plain view, suppressed because no one had dared name it. A supplier agreed to extend payment terms, not because of a threat, but because Nolan had told them the full truth instead of managing them with reassurances. The room, spread across a dozen screens, began to feel less like a company in collapse and more like one remembering how to function. The bank, watching the same honest numbers, agreed to open a limited operating line on the condition that Nolan retain control and report every week. The major client, presented with a production plan that carried an independent verification, chose to keep the $21 million contract in place. Blackwood Dominion had escaped immediate bankruptcy, but the $100 million valuation, the number that had glittered across the top of every announcement, was gone, and the company would have to be revalued honestly on the basis of its real assets and its real revenue. Nolan told Harrison that this was exactly what he had meant standing in that conference room with the bill at his feet. The $100 million empire built on reputation, hidden debt, and pride truly had died. The real business beneath it was still alive. Vivian met Nolan once last in the chief executive's office, now stripped of the family portraits that had hung there for 2 generations. She asked him whether he felt satisfied watching her lose everything. Nolan told her that she had not lost everything, not yet. She still had the chance to take responsibility, to cooperate with the investigation, and to rebuild a life that did not require anyone else to bend down before her. Vivian apologized, and the apology sounded real, but Nolan did not offer forgiveness in return, at least not immediately. An apology only meant something, he said, if the behavior that followed it changed. She accepted the terms of that hard truth, agreeing to cooperate fully with the auditors and to surrender the severance package that would have rewarded her for the wreckage. Harrison Kingsley asked Nolan to become the permanent chief executive once the restructuring period ended, and Nolan agreed only on his own conditions. The company would implement a profit-sharing program for its workers, and it would grant a seat on the board to a representative chosen by the employees themselves. The board approved both conditions. Blackwood Dominion would no longer be the private empire of a single family, ruled from a top floor no ordinary worker could reach. It would become something closer to what it had always claimed to be, a place where the people who built the aircraft had a voice in the decisions that governed their lives. The old structure of absolute power was finished, and something more durable was rising in its place. 3 months later, Blackwood Dominion was renamed Dominion North Aerospace. The change did not erase the company's history so much as mark the end of a culture in which one person's pride could outweigh 600 livelihoods. Nolan Reed was appointed the permanent chief executive once the restructuring period ended, and he kept a plane office, refused a private aircraft, and required that every risk report be delivered directly to the board without passing through the chief executive's hands first. Conrad Sterling and Grant Carrington faced criminal investigation, civil suits, and asset freezes tied to the shell companies they had used, and there was no need to describe prisons or violence.
The consequence that mattered was that they lost their power, their money, and their ability to manipulate anyone ever again. Vivian Blackwood cooperated with the investigation. She was never restored to her position, and there was no softening romance between Nolan and her. Her redemption began and could only begin with the simple act of accepting the consequences of what she had done. Marin appeared for the second time on the day she came to walk her father home after work. She saw his name on the executive board in the lobby, and she saw that he still carried the same worn leather case he had carried for years. She asked him, half teasing, whether they were rich now. Nolan told her they had enough, and that something mattered far more than being rich. No one in that company would ever again have to sell their self-respect to keep their job. He said it lightly, but he meant every word of it, and Marin, who had always been able to read him, understood that he did. In the company's first corporate ethics training, the envelope holding the $100 bill was used as an example of retaliation against a person who reports wrongdoing. Nolan did not keep the bill as a trophy, and he did not frame it on his office wall like a hunter's prize. It served a purpose now, and that was enough. In the final scene, a young employee dropped a bill near the elevator doors, fumbling it out of a pocket in the morning rush. Nolan bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to her, then continued on his way without a word. He could bend down to help another person, but no one had the power ever again to make him bend down to prove they stood above.